The Gilded Age did not end with a crash. There was no single moment when the lights went out across America's great houses, no midnight eviction, no sudden collapse. Instead, it ended quietly, with ledgers, invoices, and arithmetic that no longer bent to ambition. When we last walked the halls of Biltmore, we saw what survival looked like. A palace built at the peak of American confidence, saved not by grandeur, but by reinvention. But Biltmore was the exception. Outside its gates, across the country, hundreds of estates faced the same reckoning, and most did not escape it. At the turn of the 20th century, America was filled with houses designed for a world that no longer existed. They were built to display permanence, to signal that wealth had arrived and intended to stay. Stone walls thick enough to outlast generations, ballrooms sized for dynasties, service corridors designed so that labor remained invisible. But permanence is expensive, and by the time the Gilded Age realized this, the bills were already overdue. The shift began subtly: a new income tax, higher wages, changing social expectations. Families that once measured success by how many servants they employed began counting how many they could afford to let go. Coal deliveries became line items instead of assumptions. Roof repairs became negotiations. Entire wings went dark, not out of neglect, but strategy. The old system had relied on a simple truth: money flowed in faster than it flowed out. Investments compounded. Industries expanded. Railroads paid dividends. Steel mills printed wealth. The house, no matter how large, was just a symbol at the end of the pipeline. That pipeline narrowed, and when it did, the houses, enormous, rigid, and unforgiving, revealed their true nature. They were not assets, they were liabilities. Across the Northeast, in Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, families who had built their fortunes in a single lifetime now faced a problem no generation before them had solved. How do you maintain a home built for an era of excess when excess itself has become unfashionable and unaffordable? The Gilded Age elite had prepared for many things: competition, political pressure, even public resentment. What they had not prepared for was sustainability. These houses had been designed to impress guests, not accountants. Their owners assumed the future would resemble the past, that the conditions which allowed such homes to exist would continue indefinitely. But history does not reward assumptions, it tests them. And the test came slowly. Servants left first, not dramatically, but gradually. A butler not replaced, a footman reassigned, entire teams reduced to skeleton crews. The illusion remained, but only from a distance. Behind the walls, routines collapsed. Rooms once polished daily gathered dust. Fires went unlit. Corridors echoed. The houses were still standing, but they were no longer alive. World War I accelerated the process. Labor shortages, rising costs, shifting priorities. The war did not destroy these estates, it exposed how fragile they already were. When peace returned, the world they had been built for did not. Then came the 1920s, a decade of apparent revival. Markets surged, parties returned, jazz filled ballrooms that had been silent for years. For a moment, it seemed as though the Gilded Age might reinvent itself. But the revival was uneven, superficial. Many estates survived the decade not because they were healthy, but because their decline had been delayed. When the Great Depression arrived, it removed all pretense. Income evaporated, investments collapsed, endowments vanished. Suddenly, families who owned hundreds of rooms could not afford to heat a dozen. Property taxes alone became crushing. Maintenance deferred during the war now demanded attention and payment. Some owners tried to hold on. Pride mattered. Selling was failure. Downsizing was humiliation. Opening one's home to strangers was unthinkable. Others left quietly.
Estates were abandoned not because they were unloved, but because love was no longer enough. A mansion does not care about nostalgia. It responds only to resources. The countryside filled with silent houses, windows boarded, roofs leaking, gardens overtaken by weeds. These were not ruins of ancient civilizations. They were casualties of modern economics. And yet, amid this quiet collapse, a new idea began to form. What if a house did not have to remain private to survive? What if legacy could be shared? This was a radical thought. For generations, privacy had been the point. These homes were designed to separate, to elevate, to exist apart from the public world. Opening them was not just a financial decision, it was a philosophical one. Biltmore would eventually embrace this idea, but it was not the first, nor was it alone. Across the country, a handful of families began experimenting. Limited tours, special events, seasonal openings, carefully controlled access, framed not as commerce, but as education, preservation. The language mattered. No one wanted to say they were charging admission to survive. They said they were preserving history, sharing culture, contributing to the public good. Sometimes this was true, sometimes it was necessary. Often it was both. But most estates never reached that moment. They waited too long. They assumed conditions would improve, that markets would recover, that fortunes would rebound, that the old rules would return. They didn't. And so the American landscape changed, not overnight, but irrevocably. The great houses that had once defined the Gilded Age began to disappear, demolished, repurposed, or left to decay. Their land sold, their contents auctioned, their names remembered only in photographs. What survived were not the grandest houses, but the most adaptable ones. The lesson was quiet, but unforgiving. Wealth alone does not guarantee longevity. Purpose does. In the years that followed, America would be forced to decide what these houses were meant to be. Private dreams, public institutions, symbols of excess, or lessons in restraint. The answer would shape not just architecture, but memory itself. Because when the Gilded Age ended, it did not vanish, it fragmented. And in the fragments, a new story began.
When the Gilded Age houses began to fail, they did not all fail the same way. Some were dismantled deliberately. Others were left to rot. A few burned, either by accident or by neglect. What they shared was not tragedy, but inevitability. Their scale had been justified by wealth that no longer existed and by confidence that history refused to honor. In Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia, Linwood Hall stood as one of the clearest examples of this collapse. Built for Peter A.B. Widener, a titan of transportation and finance, the house was not merely large, it was monumental. A neoclassical palace designed to rival European estates, filled with art, marble, and ambition. At its height, Linwood Hall required dozens of staff to function. Its rooms were vast, its ceilings high, its maintenance constant. But Widener's fortune, like many of his era, was concentrated, dependent on industries vulnerable to regulation, taxation, and market shifts. When the family line fractured and the wealth thinned, the house remained, immovable, unyielding, and impossibly expensive. For decades, Linwood Hall lingered, not preserved, not fully abandoned, too large to sell, too costly to maintain, too culturally significant to demolish outright. It existed in a state worse than ruin, suspended, decaying slowly, its fate endlessly deferred. Its decline was not sudden, it was procedural. Each year without investment deepened the damage. Roofs failed, water intruded, ornamental details cracked. The building absorbed neglect the way it once absorbed wealth, relentlessly. Linwood did not fall because no one valued it.
It fell because value without funding is sentiment, not preservation. In New York City, the collapse took a different form. There, land mattered more than memory. Cornelius Vanderbilt II built a mansion so large it occupied an entire block on Fifth Avenue. It was a fortress of limestone and authority, designed to dominate not just the street, but the city's imagination. Inside were grand staircases, formal galleries, and rooms meant to intimidate as much as entertain. But cities evolve faster than estates. By the early 20th century, Fifth Avenue had transformed. Commercial pressure mounted, property taxes soared. The land beneath the mansion became more valuable than the house itself. When the decision came, it was brutal and efficient. The mansion was demolished, not because it had failed structurally, not because it lacked beauty, but because it no longer made economic sense to exist. In its place rose office buildings, profitable, practical, forgettable. The demolition marked a turning point. It sent a clear message to America's elite. No house, no matter how grand, was immune to arithmetic. Across New Jersey and Long Island, similar stories unfolded. Estates built for seasonal living, summer palaces meant to host guests for weeks at a time, suddenly found themselves occupied only days. Staffing them year-round made no sense. Heating them through winter was absurd. Selling them was difficult. Buyers capable of affording the maintenance were increasingly rare. Some families subdivided their land. Others sold off interiors piece by piece. Ballrooms became banquet halls. Libraries were stripped of shelves. Fireplaces, once symbols of warmth, became liabilities that leaked heat and demanded constant repair. A house designed to feel permanent becomes fragile the moment its purpose disappears. And purpose in the Gilded Age had been singular: display. These estates were not built to generate income, they were built to consume it. Their owners never intended them to earn their keep. That would have implied limitation, constraint, acknowledgement of cost. The illusion was that wealth itself was permanent. History corrected that illusion. By the 1930s, the countryside was dotted with empty shells. Some were sold to institutions, schools, hospitals, monasteries, stripped of ornament and repurposed. Others passed through multiple owners, each hoping to extract something of value before surrendering to reality. A few became cautionary tales whispered among preservationists. Others vanished entirely, remembered only in grainy photographs and auction catalogs. The public, too, was changing. Where once these estates inspired awe, they now provoked resentment. During the Depression, a palace standing empty was no longer impressive, it was offensive. Symbols of excess in an age of scarcity invited criticism rather than admiration. This shift mattered. It meant that saving an estate required more than money, it required justification. Why should such a house exist at all? That question haunted every remaining owner. Some answered it too late. Others never answered it at all. And then there were those who watched these failures carefully. They studied what had gone wrong. They noted which houses fell first, the most rigid, the most isolated, the least adaptable. They understood that survival would require surrendering something sacred: privacy, control, pride. What emerged from this observation was not yet a movement, but an instinct. A realization that if these houses were to survive, they would need a new relationship with the world outside their gates. They would need to stop being monuments to wealth and start becoming something else. The houses that fell taught this lesson without mercy. Their silence spoke louder than their former splendor ever had.
By the early 1930s, the question was no longer whether the great houses were expensive. That much had been obvious for years. The question now was whether they deserved to exist at all. For generations, ownership of a great estate had implied permanence.
These were not houses meant to change hands frequently. They were designed as dynastic anchors, places where memory accumulated, not assets that depreciated. But memory does not pay taxes. And as the economic pressure mounted, even the most powerful families were forced into calculations they had once considered beneath them. Heating costs, roof repairs, staff wages, insurance, property tax assessments based not on use but on theoretical value. Each line item chipped away at the illusion that wealth alone could sustain tradition. The arithmetic was relentless. A ballroom that hosted a single party a year cost as much to maintain as a small hotel. A library used by one person required the same care as a public institution. Entire wings existed solely to remind visitors of what the family once could afford. Closing them felt like failure. Keeping them open was worse. The emotional conflict was profound. These houses were not just properties, they were identities. To alter them was to admit that the world which created them had passed. And yet, the families who clung most fiercely to pride often lost everything. Those who adapted, quietly, reluctantly, survived. The earliest experiments were modest. A guided tour on a single afternoon, invitations framed as cultural outreach rather than commerce, a small admission fee described as a donation. Language mattered. No one wanted to say they were charging people to enter their home. They said they were sharing history. They said they were educating the public. They said they were preserving the past. All of these were true, but none of them were free. At first, the public response was uncertain. Visitors were curious but cautious. The idea of walking through a private palace still felt transgressive. Guests whispered. They avoided touching walls. They treated the experience like trespassing through memory. But curiosity grew. People wanted to see how the other half had lived, not out of envy, but out of fascination. These houses were windows into an era already slipping beyond reach. An America of servants' bells and formal dinners, of rigid hierarchies and absolute confidence. The houses became classrooms. And slowly something unexpected happened. The public began to care. Preservation societies formed. Historians took notice. Architects documented details before they disappeared. Photographers captured rooms before decay claimed them. For the first time, the value of these estates was no longer measured solely by their owners. It was shared. This shift changed everything. Once a house became culturally significant, demolition became controversial, neglect became visible, abandonment became a public loss rather than a private one. But preservation came with conditions. A preserved house could no longer exist solely for its owner's pleasure. It had to justify itself, economically, educationally, socially. This is where many efforts failed. Opening a house to the public does not make it cheaper to maintain. It makes it more expensive. Floors wear faster. Climate control becomes essential. Staffing increases. Insurance premiums rise. The margin for error narrows. Preservation is not nostalgia, it is management. Those who understood this early laid the groundwork for survival. They professionalized. They hired curators instead of cousins, accountants instead of advisors. They tracked visitor numbers, studied wear patterns, scheduled maintenance not when something broke, but before. They treated legacy like a system, not a shrine. Others could not make the transition. They opened their homes emotionally, but not structurally. They resisted change while expecting revenue. They resented visitors even as they depended on them. They preserved appearances while ignoring fundamentals. Those houses joined the fallen. By the mid-century, a new category had emerged in American life, the historic estate. Not a private residence, not a ruin, something in between. These places were no longer frozen in time, they were curated, stories selected, rooms interpreted, narratives shaped. What visitors saw was not daily life, but a version of it, edited for understanding. This raised uncomfortable questions. Whose history was being preserved? Which stories were told and which were omitted? Servants' quarters, once hidden, became exhibits. Service corridors became pathways. The invisible labor that had sustained the illusion of effortlessness was finally acknowledged, if imperfectly. The great houses were teaching lessons their builders never intended. They were no longer monuments to certainty. They were warnings about excess, fragility, and adaptation. And yet, amid all this reckoning, one truth became clear. The houses that survived did so not because they were the largest, or the most beautiful, or the most expensive. They survived because someone was willing to surrender the fantasy of permanence and replace it with purpose. In the next chapter of this story, that purpose would evolve again, because some estates would discover that preservation alone was not enough. They would have to reinvent not just their finances, but their identity.
By the middle of the 20th century, the question surrounding America's great estates had changed. It was no longer, can these houses survive? It was now, what are they for? The answer would reshape not just architecture, but the way a nation understood its past. Preservation, as a concept, was not new. America had saved landmarks before: battlefields, birthplaces, monuments tied to founding myths. But the Gilded Age estates presented a different challenge. These were not symbols of national unity. They were symbols of inequality, ambition, and excess. Saving them required a reframing. They could no longer be defended as private achievements. They had to be justified as public resources. This shift did not happen overnight. It was gradual, contested, and deeply uncomfortable for many families who still lived inside these houses. Opening one's doors to the public meant surrendering control over narrative. Visitors asked questions. Historians dug into archives. The polished version of the past was no longer enough. Yet the alternative was disappearance. Organizations began to form with a new purpose, not to celebrate wealth, but to contextualize it, to explain how these houses functioned, who built them, who maintained them, who benefited, and who paid the price. The historic estate became an educational tool. Guided tours replaced private strolls. Interpretive pracs replaced silence. Rooms once used daily were frozen into representative moments, chosen carefully to tell a story that could be understood in 30 minutes. What had once been fluid life became curated memory. This professionalization saved many houses, but it also transformed them. The mansion was no longer a home. It was an institution. With that transformation came rules, standards, conservation practices, climate controls calibrated not for comfort but for preservation, visitor limits imposed not by etiquette but by structural tolerance. A staircase could only carry so many feet before it wore down. A rug could only absorb so much traffic before it faded. Every decision became a negotiation between access and survival. This tension defined the new era. Some estates embraced it fully. They developed educational programs, partnered with universities, published research, became centers of scholarship as much as tourism. Others resisted. They allowed visitors but withheld context. They framed their story narrowly, focusing on beauty while avoiding complexity. Those houses survived physically, but not intellectually. And then there were estates that went further. They realized that preservation alone did not guarantee stability. Admission fees fluctuated, tourism was seasonal, maintenance costs were constant. Relying solely on visitors made survival precarious. These estates searched for diversification. They hosted events, weddings, lectures, concerts. Some introduced restaurants, gift shops, educational workshops. Others experimented cautiously with branding, publications, memberships, donor programs. The idea was simple but radical for its time. The estate had to earn its place.
This transformation altered public perception. What had once been seen as monuments to excess were reframed as engines of local economies. They employed staff, attracted tourism, supported surrounding communities. In towns hollowed out by industrial decline, these houses became anchors. The irony was unmistakable. Homes built to separate the elite from society now sustained the society around them. But not all estates could make this transition. Some were too remote, others too damaged, others still too rigid, their layouts incompatible with public use, their owners unwilling to compromise. Preservation is not democratic. It rewards those who adapt. By the time the National Historic Preservation Act formalized federal involvement, the landscape had already changed. The survivors had been selected not by beauty or fame, but by flexibility. The Gilded Age houses that remained standing were no longer symbols of unchecked ambition. They were case studies. Each told a different story about what happens when wealth outpaces foresight and what becomes possible when legacy is treated as responsibility rather than entitlement. Yet, even as institutions took over, one contradiction remained unresolved. These houses were preserved, but they were no longer lived in as they were built to be. They existed in a permanent state of presentation. And in that stillness, something new was about to emerge, because not every estate chose to become a museum. Some would take a very different path.
Not every mansion accepted its fate as a quiet archive of the past. Some houses refused stillness. They refused silence. They refused to become frozen behind velvet ropes. One estate, more than any other, would prove that survival did not require surrender, only transformation. Its name was Mar-a-Lago. Built in the 1920s by serial heiress Marjorie Merriweather Post, Mar-a-Lago was never intended to be subtle. Spanning more than 100 rooms, positioned between the Atlantic Ocean and Florida's intracoastal waterway, it was designed as a stage, not a sanctuary. Post envisioned it as a center of American diplomacy, a place where power would gather under chandeliers instead of flags. She spared no expense. European tiles, Spanish architecture, gold accents, imported materials chosen not for efficiency, but for symbolism. This was not a house built to endure quietly. It was built to be noticed. Yet even Mar-a-Lago faced the same post-war reality as every other great estate. Maintenance was relentless, taxes rose, staff costs increased. The social world it had been built for began to evaporate. By the 1970s, the property was no longer sustainable as a private residence. Post attempted a solution familiar to the era. She donated the estate to the federal government, hoping it would serve as a presidential retreat, a southern counterpart to Camp David. The government declined. The cost of upkeep was too high. The house was returned. This moment marked a crucial divergence in American estate history. Most estates at this point faded. Mar-a-Lago did not. In the 1980s, it was purchased by a man who understood something previous owners did not. Donald J. Trump did not see Mar-a-Lago as history. He saw it as leverage. Rather than preserving the estate as a museum, Trump redefined it as a private club. Membership fees replaced admission tickets. Exclusivity replaced education. The mansion returned to active use, not as a family home, but as a power hub. This was reinvention, not preservation, and it worked. The estate became profitable, self-sustaining, symbolic. Its value was no longer tied to square footage or architectural merit, but to access. Mar-a-Lago proved something revolutionary. A historic estate could survive by becoming relevant, not reverent. But relevance demanded adaptation, and adaptation always carries risk.
Across the country, other estate owners took note. Some experimented with clubs, others with luxury hospitality, some quietly incorporated businesses within historical shells. The lesson was clear. If a mansion could generate influence, it could justify its existence. This marked the beginning of the modern estate era, where legacy was no longer inherited but engineered. Yet beneath this reinvention lay a deeper tension, because relevance demands adaptation, and adaptation always carries risk. By the turn of the 21st century, America's great estates faced a new kind of pressure. Not decay, not abandonment, but competition. The world had changed faster than stone could adapt. Wealth no longer required land. Power no longer needed permanence. Influence moved at the speed of fiber optic cables, not carriage roads. And yet, quietly, the estates endured, but only by changing who they served. The heirs of industrial fortunes were no longer the dominant buyers of historic mansions. Their place was taken by founders, investors, financiers, men and women whose wealth appeared suddenly, often invisibly, and expanded globally without roots. To them, an estate was not a legacy, it was a signal. A Georgian manor in New England, a Beaux Arts palace outside San Francisco, a hidden compound in Virginia horse country. These houses became something different. They were no longer homes, they were anchors. New wealth sought old walls for legitimacy. Stone carried authority that startups could not. 100-year-old mansion whispered permanence in a world obsessed with disruption. Inside these estates, the rituals changed. Boardrooms replaced ballrooms, private airstrips replaced carriage houses, security rooms replaced servant corridors. Yet the outward appearance remained untouched. Tourists drove past unaware. Preservation plaques stayed mounted. From the road, history looked intact. Inside, the present rewrote everything. Some estates became private retreat centers for global executives. Others hosted off-record summits, venture negotiations, and political fundraising disguised as weddings or charity galas. The mansion, once a symbol of inherited dominance, now functioned as infrastructure for modern power. This era blurred a dangerous line. Preservation protected the buildings, privacy protected the activity, and oversight quietly disappeared. Unlike museums, private estates answered to no curators. Unlike public institutions, they required no transparency. Their survival no longer depended on visitors, it depended on usefulness. Technology accelerated this shift. Remote work allowed power to decentralize physically. Meetings no longer needed cities. Influence no longer required skyscrapers. An estate could now host global decisions without ever appearing on a calendar. Ironically, the digital age revived the countryside, and with it, the great houses. But this revival came with a cost. Preservationists began to notice something troubling. Restorations focused on appearance, not authenticity. Modern materials hid behind antique facades. Rooms were reconfigured beyond recognition. The house survived, but the story did not. This was not neglect, it was overwrite. History remained as architecture, but vanished as meaning. And for the first time, historians faced an uncomfortable truth. An estate could be perfectly preserved and still be lost. Because legacy is not brick, it is intent. And intent had changed. The question was no longer how to save these houses. The question became, what are they being saved for? Today, America's historic estates still stand. Some gleam behind admission gates. Some rest behind hedges and silence. Some appear frozen in time, curated, photographed, preserved. But none are untouched. Because time does not leave buildings unchanged, It layers them. What began as ambition became burden. What served vanity became infrastructure. What symbolized wealth became a vessel for power. Each generation rewrote the purpose of these houses, not by erasing the past, but by standing on it. When visitors walk through grand halls today, they see chandeliers, portraits, tapestries. What they do not see is the arithmetic, the payrolls that once fed entire towns, the land sales that saved roofs but reshaped forests, the choices made behind closed doors when survival required surrender. And beneath that, the quieter truth, that preservation is never neutral. To preserve is to choose what story survives. Some estates preserved elegance but buried exploitation. Some saved architecture while erasing labor. Some celebrated founders while forgetting servants, builders, and caretakers whose lives vanished into ledgers. The walls remember, even when plaques do not. In the modern era, technology offers an illusion of transparency. Everything documented, everything searchable, everything archived. But power has learned faster. Today, ownership is layered behind trusts. Meetings are encrypted. Decisions leave no paper trail. The estate endures not because it is visible, but because it is overlooked. A paradox. The most photographed houses in America are no longer where power lives, but the quiet ones still are. And yet, despite all this, something remarkable remains. These houses refuse to disappear, not because of wealth, but because of adaptation. They became museums, they became businesses, they became meeting grounds, they became shadows. Survival required reinvention, and reinvention required sacrifice. Privacy was lost, original intent was diluted, history became selective, but survival was achieved. And that may be the most American lesson of all, because the nation itself was built the same way. Ambition followed by excess, excess followed by reckoning, reckoning followed by reinvention. The estates are not exceptions, they are mirrors. So when we ask whether these mansions are masterpieces or warnings, the answer is both. They warn us what unchecked wealth creates. They show us what adaptation can save. They remind us that legacy is not permanence, it is negotiation. Between past and present, between memory and utility, between truth and comfort. One day, even these houses will fall silent. Stone cracks, roofs fail, records vanish. What remains will not be marble or copper. It will be the choices we made about what deserved to endure. So the next time you see a mansion on a hill, ask not who built it, ask who kept it alive, and ask why. Because history does not live in houses, it watches from them. If this story changed how you see American wealth, power, and legacy, subscribe. Because there are hundreds of houses still standing, and thousands of stories still buried inside them. Which estate should we uncover next?